I walked into my own home and found my son and his wife packing up my life into boxes. They smiled and said they were helping me move to a senior facility. I stood there holding a warm apple pie I baked for them. My hands trembled. Not because I was old, but because I finally saw the truth. If your own child wants you gone, where does that leave your dignity? And what if you've spent your whole life protecting others, only to realize no one was protecting you? I came home 2 hours earlier than planned. My dentist had to cancel last minute, so instead of heading to the cafe like I usually do, I picked up a warm apple pie from Marianne's bakery. It was Derek's favorite. I thought I'd surprise them, maybe sit down for tea. That house still had my name on the deed, but I liked to knock first out of respect. This time, I didn't. The front door was unlocked. At first, I thought someone had broken in. The hallway rug was rolled up against the wall. Picture frames were missing from the mantel. There was a loud thud from upstairs, followed by the sound of cardboard scraping across the floor. I froze. Then I heard Maureen's voice, light and cheerful, humming along to a playlist that wasn't mine. I walked in further, still holding the pie. The scent of cinnamon and pastry seemed absurd against the scene in front of me. Derek was crouched in the hallway, taping up a large box. Maureen stood in the doorway of my bedroom, arms full of folded sweaters. They looked up like I'd interrupted a dinner party. Maureen smiled almost too quickly. "Oh, you're home." I nodded, still standing there like a guest in my own house. Derek stood up slowly and dusted off his hands. "We were going to call you later," he said. "We're just helping you get a head start. Everything will be ready by Friday." I asked him where I was going. He said the name of a place I recognized. Ashgrove Meadows, a luxury senior community they called it in the brochures. It was bright, modern, and sterile. I had consulted on their compliance paperwork 10 years ago. I remembered the fine print about behavioral clauses and automatic asset control if a resident showed signs of decline. I looked down at the pie. The crust had cracked in my hand. Maureen stepped forward, reaching for a vase from the kitchen counter. "We thought it might be less stressful this way," she said. "We didn't want to overwhelm you." My tea tins were gone. The rocking chair by the window had been disassembled. The life I built was being boxed and labelled without me. I walked into the living room slowly. They had even packed the old lamp my husband gave me on our last Christmas together. I placed the pie on the table. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice calm. That moment stays with me, because something shifted. I knew this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't about love or care. It was control. And I had seen it too many times in the lives of other elders, just never expected it would be me. If any of you listening have ever returned home to find it no longer yours, maybe you'll understand the silence that filled the room that day. And maybe, like me, you'll wonder when exactly love became permission to erase someone. Maureen poured herself a glass of water like nothing was unusual. She leaned against the counter, acting as if she were helping a friend pack for a beach vacation, instead of quietly dismantling my life. Derek pulled out a manila folder from one of the boxes and handed it to me without making eye contact. He called it an information packet. Inside were glossy pamphlets from Ashgrove Meadows, a printed list of activities, a meal plan calendar, and a welcome letter already addressed to me. I kept flipping through the pages, not speaking. He started explaining how the staff were highly trained, how the community was rated 5 stars online, how there was a heated indoor pool and weekly movie nights. His words felt rehearsed, like someone trying to sell a product. I finally looked up. He stood stiff, shoulders slightly hunched, the way he used to look before parent-teacher meetings as a boy. That same nervous energy. But he wasn't a boy anymore. Maureen was already making a list on her phone. Items to donate, items to put in storage. She had a plan, and it didn't include asking me what I wanted. I walked into the hallway. My slippers were missing from their usual spot. The coat rack was bare. The hallway mirror was gone. That one stopped me. It had belonged to my mother. The moment I noticed its absence, a hollowness opened in my chest. Back in the living room, I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. Derek joined me, sitting forward like he was about to pitch a new idea at work. He said they were just trying to make things easier, that I had done enough, that now was the time to relax and let others take care of me. I asked him who decided that. He hesitated, then said they both talked about it and figured this was the right time. I looked at him, then really looked. There wasn't cruelty in his eyes, but there wasn't understanding either. It was something in between. A quiet distance, like he had already placed me in a new category in his mind. Elderly, dependent, out of the way. Maureen returned with more folded towels in her arms. She smiled and said Ashgrove had a lovely garden where residents could sit and read all day. I didn't tell her I hadn't been able to sit still in one place longer than 20 minutes since my husband died. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The jar of cinnamon sticks was gone. So were my recipe cards. She had even packed away the glass measuring cup I used every week for the past 30 years. I took a breath and kept my back to them. The last thing Derek said that day before they left was that they would come back tomorrow to help me finish packing. He kissed me on the forehead and told me I'd love it there. Then they were gone, and I stood in the quiet in a house that now felt staged like a model home. Sanitized, not mine. That night I didn't cry. I made tea with a dented kettle they forgot to pack, and I sat in the dark knowing something inside me had shifted for good. The next morning I opened the folder again, the one Derek handed me the day before. I hadn't touched it after they left, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I needed to see it clearly, with fresh eyes, with the eyes I used when I used to audit long-term care contracts. The pages were neatly clipped together. I noticed Derek had highlighted certain paragraphs in yellow. One of them was a clause outlining the terms of voluntary transition. Another mentioned temporary delegation of decision-making authority. I read that one 3 times. At the bottom of the packet, tucked behind the promotional flyers, I found a single sheet. It looked like an official form, notarized and signed. The top of the page read, "Limited Durable Power of Attorney." I stared at my signature. It looked like mine. Same curve in the E, same slant. But I never signed that paper. I reached for my reading glasses and traced the date. It was 2 weeks ago. That was the week I had my annual physical. Maureen had come with me. She insisted on handling the paperwork for the insurance form. I remembered being tired, leaning against the armrest while she flipped through a clipboard. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I sat down at the table. The chair creaked beneath me, too loud in the still house. I flipped the form over. No back page. But there was a fine print note along the bottom margin. In the event of the primary's absence or incapacity, all decisions related to housing, health, and financial management may be transferred to the designated party. Signed, Eloise Crandall. I rubbed my thumb along the corner of the page, half expecting the ink to smudge. It didn't. I stood up and walked to the file cabinet in the back room. My old work papers were still there in the second drawer. Case summaries, old compliance checklists, state guidelines. I pulled out a thin blue folder and opened it to a sample affidavit. Same structure, same formatting, same margin width. The form Derek gave me wasn't a random document. It had been copied from the very toolkit I used for years to help protect other people. People like me. I leaned against the filing cabinet for a long moment. Then I picked up the phone and called Janet. She answered on the second ring. I hadn't spoken to her in 6 months, but I knew she'd remember everything. She was sharp, always had been. She worked in federal compliance and used to joke that she trusted no one under 50. I didn't explain much. I just asked if she had time to review a few documents. Her voice changed right away. She told me to bring them over that afternoon. After hanging up, I took one last look at the power of attorney form. Then I slid it back into the folder and zipped it into my tote bag. I walked past the empty bookshelf, past the spot where my mother's mirror used to hang, and I locked the door behind me. That morning, something inside me settled. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I wasn't just someone's burden to relocate. I was a woman who knew what this was, and I knew how to take it apart, piece by piece. Janet lived just 15 minutes away in a modest townhouse with a wraparound porch and potted succulents lined up like trophies. When I arrived, she already had her reading glasses perched low on her nose and a legal pad ready. We didn't waste time on small talk. I handed her the folder, and she flipped through it with the precision of someone who had been doing this for decades. She read in silence. I sat on the edge of the armchair across from her, fingers laced together the way I used to sit outside courtrooms when I still consulted. She didn't ask me how I was. She didn't need to. Her face said enough. By the time she reached the last page, she set it down gently like it might burn the table. She told me it was serious. Not just because of the forged signature. That could be challenged. But because the document had already been entered into a third-party housing agreement. She'd seen this tactic before. The moment the senior consents to relocation, the company locks in a claim on future costs, often tied to property assets, especially if the senior has equity or a retirement fund. She asked if I had recently signed any transfer authorizations. I shook my head. She nodded slowly, said we'd need to move quickly. If Derek and Maureen were working with a private senior living developer, chances were they had already submitted preliminary claims against any long-term assets I held. My home, my annuities, even my supplemental health benefits. My jaw tightened. Janet opened her laptop and began pulling up digital records. She logged into the state database for elder care filings. Within minutes, she found my name linked to a pending residential transition contract under a shell agency called Clear Sky Support Solutions. I had never heard of it, but it had Derek's signature as secondary guarantor. She leaned back and looked at me. This wasn't just about moving me into a nice retirement home. This was about control. Long-term financial restructuring masked as concern. Janet explained we could submit a formal challenge under Section 4 of the Elder Protection Clause, but that alone might not block them in time. We needed documentation, evidence that my signature had been falsified, and she needed something else. A copy of my living trust. A will. Anything proving intent to remain autonomous. I told her the original will was in the safe in my bedroom. The updated trust, the one I drafted after Harold passed, was stored at the law office downtown. I hadn't looked at it in 5 years. She said that was the next step. We set a meeting for the following morning with an attorney she trusted. Then she walked me to the door, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder. As I drove home, the streets looked different. Not darker, not more dangerous, just thinner somehow. Like the line between safety and betrayal had narrowed while I wasn't watching. Back at the house, the driveway was empty. No moving truck yet. Inside, a few more boxes had been added, labeled in Maureen's handwriting. Linens, books, keepsakes. I made myself tea and sat in the living room. The light came in at an angle that hit the empty space where the bookshelf used to be. I thought about Janet's words. About trust and proof and what could be undone. That night I didn't sleep much. Instead, I stayed at the kitchen table and began writing everything down. Dates, conversations, details. Because the next part wouldn't be about memory. It would be about facts. And I knew how to gather those. The next morning, I arrived at the law office downtown 10 minutes early. The receptionist offered me coffee, but I declined. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight, like something old and buried had begun to wake up. The attorney, Mr. Halpern, was a quiet man in his 60s, with a sharp mind and a calm demeanor. Janet trusted him, and that was enough for me. He greeted me with a small nod and motioned for me to sit. I handed him the folder with the falsified documents and a copy of my original trust, which I had picked up that morning from storage. I had also brought an older ledger from my consulting days. It contained handwritten notes on case precedents, including a few involving forged POAs. Mr. Halpern reviewed everything without interrupting. After a few minutes, he looked up and said, "We had a narrow but solid opening. Because the forged document had been used to initiate contractual agreements without my knowledge, and because I had an unbroken trail of prior legal decisions affirming my capacity and autonomy, we could challenge both the signature and the intent behind the move. But we had to move fast. The next phase of the process involved a scheduled intake evaluation at Ashgrove, which would serve as a kind of psychological rubber stamp. If I didn't show signs of resistance, that report could be used to argue implied consent. He said cases like this were often won or lost in that small window before a person appeared too compliant. I thanked him and told him compliance was the last thing I planned to be. We drew up a notice of intent to revoke the unauthorized POA and freeze any pending housing transitions involving my name. Then he helped me prepare a formal affidavit, stating I had never signed the form knowingly or willingly. As I signed the affidavit, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't rage or panic. It was precision, like lining up numbers in a column and knowing exactly which one was wrong. After leaving the office, I drove to the county records building. I requested a copy of my property title and verified it had not been transferred. My name was still on it. That gave us time. Later that day, I returned home and found a note on the kitchen table. It was in Maureen's handwriting. She said they'd be back the following morning to finalize the pack-up and take me on a little tour of Ashgrove just to ease the transition. There was a smiley face at the end. I put the note in a drawer and locked it. Then I went upstairs and pulled out a small storage box from my closet. Inside were old photos, letters from Harold, a few worn books, and the sealed envelope he had given me just before his last hospital stay. He had told me not to open it until I truly needed to know what came next. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Inside was a handwritten addendum to our trust. He had signed it, dated it, and notarized it with our attorney. It stated that in the event I was ever incapacitated, all decisions would fall to a designated third-party professional, not family. I exhaled long and slow. It was enough. Maybe just barely, but enough. That night I made copies of everything. I labelled each folder clearly, one for Mr. Halpern, one for Janet, one for the state office, and one I would keep with me. Because the next time Derek and Maureen walked through that front door, I wasn't going to be the one caught off guard. ChatGPT, Danoi. They came back the next morning just as Maureen's note had promised. I was already dressed and waiting in the living room, folders stacked neatly on the coffee table beside me. I wore a pressed blouse and slacks, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I knew they expected me to look tired, maybe even defeated. I had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. Maureen entered first, her arms full of reusable storage bins. She smiled like we were starting some cheerful home project. Derek followed, carrying a roll of packing tape and his phone already in hand. He barely looked at me before walking into the dining room. I didn't speak right away. I let them move around, fill the silence with their plans. She talked about labeling boxes for storage. He reminded her to keep electronics separate. It was as if I didn't exist, just the subject of a logistical errand. After a few minutes, I cleared my throat. They turned, startled by the interruption. I told them to sit. My voice was steady, polite, firm. Maureen glanced at Derek, and he gave a small shrug, like it was harmless to humour me. They sat on the couch, side by side, not quite meeting my eyes. I reached for the top folder. I started with the copy of the forged power of attorney. I placed it on the table and slid it toward Derek. Then the affidavit from Mr. Halpern. Then the notarized addendum Harold had left behind. I moved carefully, deliberately, letting the weight of the paper settle in. They said nothing for a while. I watched their faces. Maureen's smile faded. Her fingers gripped the edge of the couch cushion. Derek stared at the documents, his mouth slightly open, eyes scanning for something familiar. I could see it, the flicker of recognition, then denial. Then the slow realization that this wasn't going to unfold the way he had planned. I told them I had filed an official complaint, that the housing contract under Clear Sky was being challenged and the power of attorney revoked. I said that an elder fraud case had been opened. I kept my voice even, not accusing, not emotional, just facts. Maureen started to speak, but Derek cut in. He asked what I was trying to do. I told him I was doing exactly what I had spent my career teaching others to do: protect themselves. He stood up, pacing the length of the room, said he thought I'd be relieved, said they only wanted to simplify things. I reminded him that simplification without consent is not care. It's erasure. He didn't respond. Maureen sat, frozen eyes darting between the folders and the front door. I told them they were free to leave whatever they had brought, but there would be no move, no transition, no visits to Ashgrove. Not now. Not ever. Derek picked up one of the folders, leafed through it, without understanding what he was looking at. The law had never been his world. I said I'd be contacting them through legal channels from now on, that it would be better for all of us. He muttered something under his breath and walked toward the door. Maureen hesitated a moment, then followed him out without another word. When the door closed behind them, I sat back and looked around the room. It was still half-packed, but the air felt different now, lighter. Not because the threat was gone, but because the silence they left behind was mine to fill, on my terms. The house stayed quiet for 2 full days. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. I took that time to clean up the boxes they had left behind. I moved slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to examine everything. I opened each one and looked through the way Maureen had labelled them: linens, memorabilia, off-season clothes. In one box I found a photo album I hadn't seen in years. Inside were pictures from when Derek was a boy. His first bike, a trip to the lake, his graduation. I ran my hand over one photo, where Harold stood behind us, one arm around each of our shoulders. It made me pause. Not from sentimentality, but from a quiet awareness of how far things had shifted. On the 3rd day, I got a call from Janet. She said the complaint had been acknowledged and was now under formal review. Mr. Halpern had submitted the affidavit along with a statement requesting investigation into potential financial coercion. It was enough to stall any further claims against my property or health benefits, at least for now. She also mentioned something that made me stop mid-step. There was a flag in the financial records, a recent withdrawal attempt from one of my annuity accounts. It had been denied due to incomplete verification, but the attempt itself had been logged. I hadn't authorized anything. Janet told me she had flagged the account and added legal protections until further notice. I thanked her, but my stomach turned. I remembered the drawer in the den where I had kept those account statements, and I remembered Maureen spending a long time in that room the week before telling me she was organizing my paperwork. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with the light off, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I wasn't scared. Not anymore. But I felt something new now. A quiet anger. The kind that doesn't explode but settles into the bones. The next morning, I went to the local records office again. I requested a certified copy of the deed to my house, this time with a full audit history. It showed my ownership still intact, but there was a pending notation, something flagged by the senior housing entity. A claim filed in advance, likely to secure priority access in case of future sale or incapacitation. I took the document and drove straight to Mr. Halpern's office. He looked through the paperwork, nodded once, then said we had to take it a step further. He suggested a protective trust restructuring. That would shift legal ownership of the property into a trust entity with me as sole beneficiary and trustee. It would remove any ambiguity about intent or access. We began drafting the paperwork that afternoon. I called Janet on the way home and told her what we were doing. She said it was smart, long overdue. Back at the house, I made myself lunch and ate by the window. I watched the wind move through the branches outside and thought about how still the house had become. Not in a lonely way, just quiet. That evening, I gathered the rest of my personal documents and placed them into a locked cabinet. I added the new deed copy, the trust revisions, the flagged bank statement, and every single note from Janet and Mr. Halpern. The facts were clear now. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a poor choice made out of concern. It was a calculated effort to move me out, assume control, and access my assets before I could say otherwise. And that clarity gave me something unexpected. Not just resolve, but peace. Not because things were fixed, but because I had finally reclaimed the ground beneath my feet. By the end of the week, I had signed the final trust documents. The house, the accounts, and all related legal powers were now securely transferred to a protective entity with my name on every line that mattered. Janet and Mr. Halpern both reviewed it twice. We filed it with the county and with every institution where I had holdings. There was no more ambiguity, no open windows, no unlocked doors. That same Friday afternoon, a certified envelope arrived. The return address was a private mediation firm. Inside was a formal letter from Derek and Maureen requesting an amicable family resolution regarding long-term living arrangements. Polite words, professional tone. But I knew better. This was a preemptive move. They had likely realized the housing claim had stalled. Now they were trying to pivot to mask their intentions behind reconciliation and polite process. I didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, I spent the weekend going through the rest of the house. Not for packing, not for purging, just reclaiming. I rehung the mirror from my mother's bedroom. I dusted the old piano. I took out the table linens I had tucked away and ironed them with care. I made the space mine again, one drawer, one cabinet, one quiet hour at a time. Late Sunday evening, I finally sat down and drafted a letter in return. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't angry, just a clear statement that I was choosing to remain in my home, that any decisions regarding my welfare would be handled through the legal avenues now in place, and that further contact should be limited unless initiated by me. On Monday morning, I sent the letter through Janet's office. That way there would be no confusion, no edits, no rewording. That afternoon, I got a call from the state's Elder Protection Unit. A case manager had been assigned. Her name was Alicia, and she introduced herself calmly, professionally. She said she was reviewing the complaint and wanted to set up a time to visit my home, just to confirm well-being and capacity as per protocol. I agreed. There was nothing to hide. She arrived 2 days later. Early 40s, well-dressed, sharp eyes. We sat in the dining room. She asked questions about my daily routine, my financial awareness, my medical access. I answered each one without hesitation. She reviewed the documents I provided, especially the trust and POA revocation, and took notes. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. She told me most people only act after something irreversible happens, that filing a complaint this early with this much clarity was rare. She said it was the kind of case that helped change patterns, not just resolve them. I walked her to the door and thanked her. That night I went out to the porch. The air was still. The town felt smaller than it used to. Or maybe I had just become more aware of what truly belonged to me. The sky overhead was soft with the fading light of early spring. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to lift. I didn't feel victorious. That wasn't the word. It was steadier than that, like finding your footing after a long walk on uneven ground. Inside, I folded the new documents into my cabinet, then sat with a notebook and began writing again. Not just the facts, but reflections, small things, observations about strength, about silence, about how easily love can be replaced with ownership if you're not watching closely. Because I had watched, and now I had taken it back, quietly, completely, on my own terms. 2 weeks passed without a word from Derek or Maureen. The quiet wasn't exactly comforting, but it gave me space to think. I kept up with my daily routines, morning walks, a bit of gardening, coffee on the porch, and every few days I sat down with Janet or Mr. Halpin to go over next steps. Nothing dramatic, just maintenance, defense in stillness. Then one morning I received a certified invitation. It wasn't a surprise, not really. Derek and Maureen were hosting a family dinner, a gathering to reconnect at their home, set for the following Sunday evening. The tone was sugary. There was even a note at the bottom that said they missed me and hoped we could all begin again. I read it twice, then set it on the counter. That same day, Alicia from the Elder Protection Office followed up. She said the initial case report had been completed and confirmed all prior findings. There was no legal ground for their prior actions. She asked if I wanted to proceed with a formal citation or keep the case dormant unless needed. I told her to hold it in place, but not escalate, at least not yet. I spent the next few days thinking, not just about what they had done, but about what I had allowed, about the silence I had accepted in the name of peace. I thought about Harold, about how he used to say that real dignity never raises its voice, it simply stops explaining. Sunday came faster than I expected. I didn't dress up. I didn't bring anything. I arrived right on time, walking in with my shoulders squared. Their house was lit, softly music playing low in the background. Other relatives were already there, a few cousins. One or two of Derek's friends I hadn't seen since Harold's funeral. Everyone greeted me with polite smiles and cautious eyes. Maureen greeted me like nothing had happened. She kissed my cheek, took my coat, and guided me toward the dining room like a perfect hostess. Derek followed behind his eyes, watchful, quiet. The dinner began with small talk, stories about the kids, jokes about traffic, a few glances my way, expecting me to chime in. I stayed quiet, observing, listening. Then after the dishes had been cleared and dessert was brought out, Derek stood. He tapped a spoon against his glass and said a few words about family, about forgiveness, about wanting to move forward. Then he looked at me and said they had something to share. He pulled out a folder. My breath caught. But it wasn't a trap. It was a proposal, a real one this time. Derek explained that they had decided to put their names down for a long-term care residency for themselves. Not for me. He said they realized they were projecting fears about aging, about responsibility, that trying to manage me was easier than facing their own discomfort with change. He said they were ashamed. Maureen added that she hadn't understood how much of my independence was tied not just to where I lived, but to the right to choose. She admitted to overstepping, to making assumptions about what care looked like. The room fell quiet. Then I spoke, calmly. I said that what mattered now was not the apology, but the clarity. I told them I wouldn't be erased or relocated like an old chair in the wrong room, that I had rebuilt too much in silence to give it up now. But I also told them I was open to beginning again, slowly, deliberately, with respect. No one clapped, no one made a speech, but Maureen looked down, her hands folded tightly, and Derek nodded once. Small, almost imperceptible. But it was enough for the moment. When I left that night, the sky was dark and clear. I walked to my car alone, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. Not heavy, not light, just steady. And that was exactly how I wanted it. In the days following that dinner, I kept waiting for the shift to feel more permanent, for the apology to stretch into something tangible. But change, real change, doesn't walk in with a fanfare. It shows up in small decisions, quiet choices made in private. I noticed it first when Maureen sent over a handwritten card. Just a simple note, no excuses, no explanations. She thanked me for attending the dinner and said she was starting counselling. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't even ask to meet again. She just said she understood that rebuilding trust would take more than words. That was the first time I believed she might mean it. Then Derek called, not to ask for anything, not to rehash the past. He said he had been thinking a lot about Harold, about how his father used to sit with a problem long before reacting to it. He said he hadn't done that with me, that instead of sitting with his fears, he had tried to manage mine. He said he was sorry for that, and that he didn't expect anything from me right now. I thanked him, but I didn't make promises. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I returned to volunteering at the community legal centre 2 afternoons a week. It wasn't formal work, just reviewing documents, helping people with small claims, or teaching them how to read fine print in leases. That brought me back to a steadier rhythm, one not centred around protecting my home, but offering others tools to protect theirs. At night, I began writing letters, not to send, just to get the thoughts out. Some to Harold, some to myself. Some to the versions of Derek and Maureen I had once trusted. It wasn't about blame. It was about releasing what didn't need to be carried anymore. One afternoon, Janet stopped by with a small bundle of mail and a smile that said more than words. She said the case had officially been marked resolved. The state's records now reflected all updates to my trust, my legal status, and the protective measures put in place. Everything was clean, finalized. She even brought a letter from Alicia, who had closed the case, with a short note of admiration. It said strength, when paired with clarity, was more powerful than most people realized. That evening I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea. The sun was setting slowly, brushing everything in soft gold. For the first time in months, my thoughts didn't race. There was no next step, no file to update, no meeting to prepare for. It was just me in my own home, exactly where I chose to be. And as I sat there, I began to see that the greatest shift wasn't in Derek or Maureen. It was in me. I no longer moved from a place of fear. I no longer lived waiting for the next betrayal. I had faced it, named it, handled it, on my own terms. Even if the future brought more complications, I had proof now, not just in legal documents, but in my own voice. I had chosen not to disappear, not to be managed, not to be pitied or parented by those I had once raised. And that choice, repeated quietly each day, had become a kind of freedom, one I hadn't known I was missing until I reclaimed it. A few weeks later, I received an invitation in the mail. Not a dinner, not a family talk. It was a flyer for a local panel discussion on elder rights and legal protections for seniors. I recognized the host organization. It was the same advocacy group Janet had once worked with in her early years. At first, I set it aside. I wasn't ready to stand in front of strangers and speak about what had happened. But later that night, something shifted in me. I thought about how long I had lived in silence, how many women my age had gone through something similar, but never said a word. I thought about how easily it could have ended differently if I hadn't acted when I did. So I called the number listed at the bottom of the flyer. A young woman named Callie picked up. She sounded surprised when I asked if they were still looking for speakers. I told her I wasn't a lawyer or a social worker, just someone who had learned a few things the hard way. She said that was exactly the kind of voice they needed. The event took place in the meeting room at the town library. Chairs arranged in a neat half-circle, a modest crowd, mostly older adults. A few younger ones sitting beside them, maybe their children or caregivers. When it was my turn, I stood without notes. I didn't tell them everything, just enough. Enough for them to understand how easy it was to be silenced, how subtle the control could be, how even the people you raised could believe they knew what was best for you while ignoring your voice entirely. I told them about the day I walked in on my own life being boxed up without permission, about how it felt to be smiled at like a problem being solved. I told them about the moment I stopped asking for explanations and started drawing lines. When I finished, there was a pause. No applause, no gasps. Just silence. A kind of stillness that told me they understood. Then slowly a woman near the back stood and thanked me. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. After the panel ended, Callie approached with a small stack of cards in her hand. She asked if I'd consider speaking again. Not every week. Just now and then. She said they needed voices like mine. I told her I'd think about it. As I walked to my car, the wind picked up, slightly tugging at the ends of my coat. The trees along the sidewalk had just begun to bloom. I stood for a moment before unlocking the door, just breathing it in. For so long I had seen strength as something quiet and solitary, something held in place by dignity and restraint. But now I was beginning to see that sometimes strength could be spoken. It could be shared. It could echo in rooms where others needed to hear it. That night I went home and placed the flyer on my kitchen table, not as a memory, but as a reminder that the story I had once feared would end in silence had found its way into the light, and I had been the one to carry it there. I didn't plan a celebration. I didn't need one. But on the first Sunday of the new season, I opened all the windows in the house. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, laid out the good plates, and made a simple breakfast. Bacon, eggs, and biscuits, just for me. I sat at the table where Harold used to read the paper. Sunlight stretched across the floor, warming the kitchen tiles. It wasn't loud or grand, just quiet and mine. Derek called later that afternoon. His voice was softer than usual. He said Maureen had signed them up for an elder care workshop series. He asked if I might want to come to one just as a guest. I told him I'd think about it. He didn't press. Before we hung up, he said one last thing. He said he finally understood why I fought so hard to stay. Not because I was stubborn, but because I had spent decades giving everything away without asking what I wanted in return. That night I found myself looking through old photographs, not out of nostalgia, but to remember who I had been before the storm. A mother, yes. A wife. But also a woman who had once climbed the Grand Canyon trails with blisters on her heels. A woman who knew her own mind. She had never left. She had just been waiting for me to find her again. The seasons shifted slowly. One morning, the dogwoods bloomed outside the window, pink and full. I poured coffee into the same chipped mug I always used and sat on the porch, wrapped in my favorite cardigan, the one Maureen used to call old-fashioned. I watched the neighborhood breathe. children on bikes, a neighbor walking his terrier, the world going on unchanged. But something inside me had moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need to reclaim what had been taken. I had created something better in its place, a life with clear lines, a home that no one could box up behind my back. When I stepped back inside, I felt it fully, that this was not the same house I had nearly been removed from. It was the one I had rebuilt, brick by brick, boundary by boundary, not just in walls and papers, but in presence, in voice. And in that silence, I finally felt it. Not revenge, not justice, just peace, and a deep, full kind of knowing. This time I chose myself, and that choice changed everything. If you've ever felt pushed aside, unheard, or quietly erased in your own home, maybe this story touched a part of you. Leave a comment if you've lived through something similar. And if you're still in the middle of it, I hope you remember this. Your voice matters. You don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes choosing to stand quietly for yourself is the loudest thing you'll ever do. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.